everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode.
Ever get that, little jolt when you're at the gas station and the prices jumped up again? Or you hear about tariffs on the news and can't help but wonder, okay, but how does this actually affect me?
It's definitely a topic that hits home for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. So today, we're going to really get into it. We're doing a deep dive on all these new tariffs that just got put in place.
Right.
Sifting through news reports, all the economic analysis and expert opinions to try to figure out, what these changes mean for your wallet, for the economy as a whole.
I think that's what everyone's trying to figure out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the goal here is to kind of cut through all the jargon and the complexity of trade policy. We want to give you a clear picture of how these tariffs work, who's really going to feel the impact, and what the potential ripple effects could be down the line.
That's the mission.
Right. To make sense of this, we've gone through a ton of material, news articles breaking down the specifics, in-depth analysis from institutions, legal perspectives, even government data and statements.
Lots to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. So to kick things off, let's just start with the basics. What exactly are tariffs and why are we seeing them now?
Okay. So in the simplest terms, tariffs are taxes on goods coming into the country from other places.
Okay, so like an extra charge.
Exactly. And the official reasoning behind this new wave of tariffs really points to several key objectives.
Okay.
One is protecting American industries from, competition from overseas companies.
Okay, so trying to level the playing field.
Yeah, trying to level the playing field. Another big one is addressing those trade deficits we've been seeing. They've been a concern for a while now.
Right.
And then finally, there's this idea of securing our supply chains, especially for things that are crucial for national security.
Right, making sure we have what we need. So a central piece of all this seems to be this Executive Order 14257. Came out on April 2nd. It talks about imposing what it calls reciprocal tariffs on a whole lot of our trading partners. So that sounds pretty big.
It is quite broad. And what's interesting is this order specifically uses the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as its legal basis.
IEPA.
IEEPA, exactly. And the justification given is a declared national emergency concerning trade deficits, which, the order points out, reached a whopping $1.2 trillion in 2024.
That's a huge number.
It's a substantial figure. And, that's a 40% increase in just the last 5 years. So it's not a small issue.
No, not at all. And the order actually lists out, a whole bunch of reasons why they think these deficits have gotten so big.
Yeah, it's not just one single factor.
Right.
They point to a whole range of things. Tariffs that other countries have on our goods, right? Making it harder for American products to compete. Licensing rules, technical barriers, all sorts of things that can make it tougher to sell overseas.
Like red tape and regulation.
Exactly, making it harder to navigate the process. Then there's the issue of intellectual property protection. The order argues that there's insufficient protection in some places, which puts American companies at a disadvantage.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And then you've got government subsidies in other countries,
Right.
which could give their companies an unfair edge. There are also concerns about lower labor and environmental standards in some places, potentially leading to cheaper production costs, but at what cost?
Right.
And then, of course, there's the perennial issue of currency manipulation and even broader concerns like, corruption affecting fair competition.
It's a pretty long list.
It's a complex picture, and what the order is really saying is, hey, the global marketplace isn't always playing by the same rules.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
What are the actual tariffs being put in place? Is it just one big increase across the board?
It's actually a two-tiered system.
Okay.
First, you've got a universal additional tariff of 10% on pretty much everything coming into the U.S. This applies to most of our trading partners.
So like a baseline increase.
Exactly, a baseline increase. But there are a couple of exceptions. Canada and Mexico are actually exempt from this one.
Right, because of existing trade agreements?
Exactly, they're already covered under different agreements. But then, on top of that 10%, you have what they call reciprocal tariffs. And these are targeted at 83 specific countries.
83, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a long list. And the rates for these vary quite a bit.
Like what kind of range are we talking?
Anywhere from 11% all the way up to 50%.
50, that's significant.
It's a big jump. And where these reciprocal tariffs apply, they actually replace that initial 10% tariff.
Okay, so it's either one or the other.
Exactly.
Can you give me some concrete examples of these reciprocal rates just to wrap my head around the scale of it?
Sure. So, for instance, anything coming from the European Union, they're looking at a 24% tariff.
Okay.
For Israel, it's 20%. And for China, once everything's fully implemented, it's going to be a whopping 44% tariff on a lot of their products.
Wow, that's a big chunk of change.
It is. These are not insignificant costs.
So when you add it all up, what's the overall impact on, like, the average level of tariffs in the U.S.? How much is this actually changing things?
Well, what's striking is the magnitude of this shift. These new measures, they're projected to push the average effective tariff rate in the U.S. to over 20%.
Over 20%.
And that's the highest it's been in over a century, since 1909, to be precise.
Wow, that's a long time.
It really marks a pretty significant departure from how we've approached trade in recent decades.
It does. And, it almost makes you think of those, like, historical parallels. I remember reading about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act from way back in the 1930s. Wasn't that, like, a time of really high tariffs?
Yes, was.
And didn't that end badly? For me, trying to understand, the potential risks here, what's the lesson from that historical example?
Well, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, it did lead to very high tariffs on all sorts of imported goods, and many economists believe that it actually made the Great Depression worse, partly because it triggered a wave of retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
Oh, so it, like, backfired.
Yeah, in a sense. And the takeaway for you is, while the scale of these new tariffs might be different, that underlying risk of setting off a chain reaction of countries hitting each other with tariffs and potentially harming the global economy, that risk is still there.
So it's like a cautionary tale.
Exactly. It's something to watch closely.
So we've talked about how these tariffs are being put in place, but let's get to the real question. Who ultimately pays the price? When you slap a tax on imported goods, where does that cost really land? As a consumer, how is this going to affect me directly?
That is the million-dollar question. And the economic consensus is pretty clear on this. While the companies that import those goods, they're the ones who physically write the check to the government, those costs, they very often get passed down the line to you, the consumer, in the form of higher prices.
So even though it's a business paying the tariff initially, it's my wallet that feels the pinch in the end.
Precisely. And in fact, recent economic studies, they've found what they call a near-complete pass-through.
Pass-through.
Yeah, meaning that almost the entire amount of the tariff gets passed on to U.S. businesses and then ultimately to consumers. So what you see as a price increase, it's very likely reflecting that tariff amount almost dollar for dollar.
And this isn't just on, like, luxury items or fancy electronics, right? This affects the everyday stuff I'm buying for my family.
Exactly. Think about your weekly grocery run, your next car, even getting your current car fixed if it needs parts that are sourced from overseas. So many everyday products, they rely on these complex global supply chains. And that means that these tariffs can lead to higher prices on a huge range of things. The fruits and vegetables you buy, electronics, appliances, clothes, shoes, you name it.
Wow. And I even saw something about the cost of building a new home going up, too.
That's right. One estimate suggested that because of tariffs on imported building materials, the average cost of a new home could increase by almost $9,200.
$9,200.
That's not chump change, especially for folks looking to buy or build.
No, it's a big chunk of money. So it sounds like pretty much everyone is going to see higher prices because of this. But will everyone be affected equally? Or will some people feel this more than others?
That's a really important point. And this is where the issue of fairness really comes into play, because experts warn that these tariffs, they could actually widen the gap between the haves and have-nots. Lower-income families, they're likely to be hit harder because, well, they generally spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods.
Yeah, if your budget is already tight, even small price increases on things you absolutely need, that can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And as one analysis pointed out, low-income households, they often spend a disproportionate amount of their earnings on basics, like food, soap, toothpaste, things you can't really cut back on. So even a small price hike on those items can really strain an already stretched budget.
So while someone with a higher income might just grumble about a slightly pricier imported car, for someone struggling to afford the basics, these tariffs could really throw things off.
It's the regressive nature of this type of tax. Take those imported cars, for example. Yeah, the prices are going up. But for someone with a larger salary, it might be an annoyance. For someone on a tight budget, that added cost could make owning a reliable car completely out of reach. And there's some hard data to back this up. An estimate from the Budget Lab at Yale suggests that households in the lowest income bracket could be looking at annual losses of almost $980 just from this April 2nd policy alone. And if you factor in all the tariffs implemented in 2025, that figure could jump to $1,700. And they also predict a pretty substantial 17% increase in apparel prices. And again, that tends to hit lower income folks harder.
Wow, those numbers really paint a stark picture. It's not just about everyone paying a little more, it's about who can actually afford that extra cost.
Exactly.
Now, one of the big arguments you always hear in favor of tariffs is that they'll encourage companies to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., create jobs here. What does the expert analysis say about this potential benefit for American workers?
Well, it's certainly one of the stated goals. But the reality is, the economics of this are much more complex. While tariffs might make domestic production more competitive, in theory, businesses might respond in other ways. They might just eat some of those tariff costs, take a hit to their profits. They could also try to find different suppliers, maybe in countries that aren't subject to these tariffs, or they might just face lower demand because their products have become more expensive.
So it's not as simple as tariffs go up, American jobs magically appear.
No, not at all. And any of those responses I just mentioned, they could actually lead to job losses, not just overseas, but potentially here in the U.S. as well, and particularly in sectors that employ a lot of lower-income workers.
Right, because if businesses are struggling, they might have to lay people off.
Exactly. And one economist who's actually advised on industrial policy, she emphasizes that this uncertainty, it makes it hard for businesses to make long-term plans. Investing in a new factory, that's a huge commitment. And if companies aren't sure these tariffs are going to last, they might not be willing to take that risk, and that means those jobs might not materialize.
So the instability itself is a problem.
It creates a lot of hesitation.
Okay. So we've talked about prices, we've talked about jobs, but what about the bigger picture, the overall health of the economy? What are the potential ripple effects beyond just my household budget?
Right. Well, the Budget Lab at Yale, they've actually projected that just the April 2nd tariff announcement on its own could shave off 0.5 percentage points from real GDP growth in 2025.
Half a percentage point.
And if you take into account all the tariffs that have been implemented this year, that negative impact could be as high as 0.9 percentage points.
Wow. So it could actually slow down the entire economy.
It could. And in the long term, they estimate that the U.S. economy could end up being 0.4% to 0.6% smaller, which translates to something like $100 billion to $180 billion less economic activity each year. And experts at the Brookings Institution, they've also voiced concerns that these tariffs, they might not even achieve their stated goal of reducing the trade deficit.
Wow.
And they could even increase the likelihood of a recession. So it's a lot of uncertainty and potentially a lot of downside risk.
So for me, trying to plan my family's budget, should I be like battening down the hatches, expecting things to get tighter?
Well, I think it's always wise to be prepared. Slower GDP growth, it often translates to a weaker job market and potentially slower wage increases. And when there's more economic uncertainty in the air, people tend to be more cautious with their spending and investments, both at the household level and at the business level.
So maybe hold off on that big purchase for now.
It might be prudent to wait and see how things play out.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of potential downsides here. But this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? What are other countries saying about all of this? How are they reacting?
They are not happy. Key trading partners have voiced strong objections.
Like, specifically?
The European Union, for example, they've been very vocal in their criticism, calling the tariffs brutal, unjustified, and expressing concern about potential negative spillover effects on the global economy. They're actively considering countermeasures, which could include tariffs of their own, potentially targeting digital services, which is a major U.S. export sector.
Oh, so it could be a tit-for-tat situation.
That's a real risk, and it's already started. Canada has announced that they're going to impose tariffs on U.S. vehicles in retaliation. And China, a major player in global trade, they've said that they will be responding in kind, essentially matching the new U.S. tariffs with their own 34% tariff on goods coming from the U.S.
So it's like a trade war brewing.
It has that potential, and it could escalate further. There have even been reports of the U.S. considering an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods if China retaliates.
50% on top of what's already there.
Exactly. Which means we could be looking at a total tariff burden of over 100% on some goods coming from China.
Wow. So this could get really messy really fast.
It could. And all of this underscores the danger of this kind of back and forth, of retaliatory tariffs. It's likely to lead to higher prices for consumers and disrupt global trade even more.
So it's like a lose-lose situation.
Potentially, yes.
Now, are there any exceptions to all of this?
Yeah.
Are some goods or some countries being treated differently under these new rules?
There are a few.
Okay, like what?
Well, for instance, informational materials are exempt, donations for humanitarian aid, things like that. Steel and aluminum products that were already subject to tariffs under a previous action called Section 232, they're also exempt. Same goes for automobiles and auto parts that were part of a separate Section 232 action. Then you've got a few other categories like copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, certain critical minerals, and energy products, all exempt.
Okay, so there's some wiggle room there.
And interestingly, countries that don't have what's called permanent normal trade relations with the U.S., places like Cuba, North Korea, Russia, and Belarus, they're also excluded. Probably because they already face high tariffs anyway.
Right, so this is more about targeting specific trading partners.
In a sense.
What about Canada and Mexico? Those are some of our biggest trading partners. What's the deal with them?
Well, they're getting special treatment under the USMCA trade agreement. So these new universal tariffs, they don't apply to goods coming from Canada or Mexico.
Okay, so they're kind of in their own category. And what about China? They already had some tariffs in place before all this, right? How did this new stuff layer on top of what was already there?
That's a good point, because China was already subject to tariffs that came out of earlier actions under IEPA and Section 301 of U.S. trade law. And these new reciprocal tariffs, they're actually in addition to those existing ones.
So that's like piling on.
Exactly. So when that new 44% rate for China fully kicks in, on top of the tariffs that were already there, we could be looking at a total tariff burden of like 54% on a lot of goods coming from mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau. And that's before we even factor in that additional 50% increase that's been threatened.
So if I'm buying something that already had a tariff, now it's going to have an even bigger one.
Potentially, yes.
It's getting complicated.
It is. And to add another layer of complexity, the president actually has the power to change these tariffs down the line, to increase them or decrease them based on a bunch of different factors.
So it's not set in stone.
Not necessarily. The order specifically says that the president can adjust these tariffs based on things like whether the U.S. trade deficit is shrinking, whether we've struck new trade deals with other countries, national security considerations, and the state of domestic manufacturing.
So this could all change again.
It's possible, and that creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses and consumers. It's hard to plan when the rules of the game keep shifting.
For sure. Now, with all this talk about prices going up, are there any other sneaky ways that consumers might see the impact of this? Beyond just like the sticker price at the store. I've heard about something called shrinkflation. What is that exactly?
Yeah, shrinkflation is something to watch out for. It's basically when manufacturers reduce the size or the quantity of a product but keep the price the same. So you're essentially getting less bang for your buck.
Sneaky.
It is. And experts recommend that consumers start paying close attention to the unit price of items, especially at the grocery store. That way, you can compare apples to apples, so to speak, and see if you're actually getting less for your money.
That's a good tip. Anything else consumers should be aware of? Anything that might directly affect how I shop?
Another change that went into effect recently, just on May 2nd actually, is the elimination of the de minimis exemption for low-value imports coming from China and Hong Kong.
De minimis exemption.
Yeah, it basically means that before, if you ordered something online from those places and it was worth less than $800, you didn't have to pay any duties on it. But now, even those smaller shipments are subject to tariffs.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just big shipments anymore. Even those small online orders, they could become more expensive.
So I need to be careful even with my online shopping.
It's worth being aware of.
Now, with such a huge shift in trade policy, are there any legal challenges happening? Is anyone trying to fight these tariffs in court?
There's at least one lawsuit out there, a company called Emily Lay Paper Inc. They import goods from China, and they're challenging the legality and constitutionality of these tariffs based on the IEPA.
Okay. And what are their main arguments? What's the basis of their case?
They're making several key points. First, they argue that these tariffs, they go beyond the power that the president actually has under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. They're invoking something called the Major Questions Doctrine, which basically says that if the government's going to do something that has massive economic consequences, Congress needs to explicitly authorize it.
So they're saying the president overstepped his bounds.
That's one argument. They also say there isn't a clear enough connection between these broad tariffs and the national emergency that was declared, which was about trade deficits.
Okay.
And then there's the argument that if you interpret the IEPA to allow these tariffs, it could violate what's called the non-delegation doctrine.
Non-delegation.
Yeah, it's a bit of a legal mouthful, but basically it means that Congress can't just hand over its powers to the president without clear limits. And traditionally, trade policy is considered a power that belongs to Congress. So they're arguing that these tariffs give the president too much unchecked authority over trade.
So it's a separation of powers issue.
Exactly. And finally, they're saying that the way these tariffs were implemented, the changes that were made to the harmonized tariff schedule, that they might have violated the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs how federal agencies create regulations.
So they're coming at it from a bunch of different angles.
They are. And it's going to be interesting to see how the courts handle this.
For sure. Historically, though, how often do these kinds of challenges to IEPA-based restrictions actually succeed?
Honestly, it's been pretty rare. Courts have generally given a lot of leeway to the executive branch when it comes to matters of national security and foreign policy. However, this case is a bit unique. It's testing some new legal theories, and the sheer size and scope of these tariffs, they're unprecedented in recent times. So it's hard to say how it will play out, and there could even be constitutional arguments raised as well about Congress's power over tariffs and the balance of power between the branches of government.
So it's a wait-and-see situation.
For now, yes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. It sounds like there's a lot to be concerned about. What practical steps can regular people like me take to prepare for all this?
Yeah.
For potentially higher prices, economic uncertainty, all of that.
Well, I think a good starting point is to really look at your personal budget, your spending habits. Where's your money going? Are there places where you could cut back? And then think about substitutes. Are there imported goods that you could replace with products made domestically?
Okay.
Or maybe explore buying things secondhand or refurbished. Those might not be as affected by these new tariffs. And when you're shopping, pay close attention to the prices of generic brands versus name brands. Sometimes you can find good deals that way. And for some folks, even exploring things like growing your own vegetables might be an option.
Get back to basics.
Exactly. However, experts do caution against going overboard with stockpiling things, especially perishable goods. You don't want to end up with a bunch of wasted food.
Right, right.
So it's about being mindful and making smart choices. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I saw something online that I wanted to get your take on. There's this claim going around that the U.S. is making like $2 billion a day from these new tariffs. Is there any truth to that?
I've seen that claim too, but when you actually look at the data from the U.S. Treasury Department, it tells a very different story. According to their records, the revenue from what they call customs and certain excise taxes, it's been averaging closer to $200 million a day this month.
$200 billion, not $2 billion.
Exactly. A big difference. And if you look at February, which is the most recent full month we have data for, the total revenue from customs duties was about $7.25 billion.
So that $2 billion a day figure, it's way off.
Yeah, it's not accurate. And it's important to remember that those tariffs, they're paid by U.S. importers when the goods come into the country,
Right.
not directly by foreign governments.
Right, so it's not like we're sending an invoice to China or something.
No. And while some of that cost might get absorbed by foreign exporters, most of the economic analysis suggests that it ends up getting passed along to us, the consumers, through higher prices.
So it's not a windfall for the U.S. government. It's just higher costs for us.
That's the bottom line. And most economists agree that tariffs are essentially a regressive tax, meaning they disproportionately impact lower-income households.
Because they're the ones who have to spend a larger share of their income on basic necessities.
Exactly. And another point of contention is the way these reciprocal tariff rates were calculated. They seem to be based more on the size of the trade deficit with each country, rather than a direct comparison of the actual tariffs that those countries have in place.
So it's like punishing countries for having a trade surplus with us.
It's a bit like that.
Okay.
And a lot of experts argue that this is a flawed approach, because trade imbalances are caused by a lot of different factors, not just tariffs. Maybe people in the U.S. just prefer certain goods from a particular country. So using the trade deficit as the basis for setting reciprocal tariffs, it doesn't really make sense.
It's like punishing them for our own consumer choices.
It's a bit like that, and it doesn't really address the root causes of those trade imbalances.
So to wrap things up here, it seems like these new tariffs are a really complex issue with a lot of potential consequences, many of them negative.
That's a fair assessment. The key takeaways for you are that these tariffs are very likely to lead to higher prices for a wide range of things, and those price increases will likely hit lower-income households the hardest.
Right.
The overall economic effects, they're still a bit uncertain, but there's a real risk of slower economic growth and even a recession. And globally, our trading partners are not happy. Many of them are considering or already implementing retaliatory measures.
So it's a tense situation, and it could get worse.
It could. And this is definitely something that we're going to have to watch closely.
For sure. And I think the big question for all of us now is, how do we adapt?
Exactly. As this global trade landscape shifts, what adjustments do individuals and businesses need to make to thrive in this new environment? It's a question worth pondering, and it's one that we'll be exploring further in future episodes.
For sure. Thanks for breaking it all down.
My pleasure.
And all of you listening out there, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay tuned.
And most importantly, stay savvy.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time.
See you then.